This is the Grand Prismatic Hot Spring at Yellowstone National Park. It's beautiful, and it's a wonderful example for us to get started with microbiology. What you can see in this image is that we have this massive area. It's covered in these bright, beautiful colors emanating from the hot spring in the center of the picture. And then out at the edges of the picture, you can see some of the pine forest that's common to Wyoming. If you look close, you'll also see the boardwalk of people coming to capture their tourist pictures or maybe a selfie or two with the hot spring. You might also notice that it's kind of dangerous looking. You can see the steam rising up, giving us a bit of a warning that maybe this isn't a good place for humans to go. You can also see the vast circle where there's no trees. And that's also telling us that if the trees don't grow there, maybe we as humans shouldn't go there either. But it doesn't mean that this area is devoid of life. In fact, the bright, beautiful colors that you're looking at here are representing lots and lots of teeming organisms. It's just that these are microorganisms. They're too small to see as individuals by eye, but there's so many of them, and they have such distinct chemical profiles that they produce these different colors from the blue to the green to the yellow to the orange to the brown. So we can actually consider this as an image of microbes. We're just looking at them from really far out. Now, as you get a little bit closer, if you ever get a chance to go and visit this, and I hope that you do because it's amazing. It's one of many awesome sites in Yellowstone. You'll see these little signs on the boardwalk. They say, "Do not mark bacterial mats." And so one of the lessons here is that even though these small microbes can survive the extreme temperatures of a hot spring, and it goes way beyond the conditions for life that work for us, even though they can survive those extreme conditions, it doesn't mean that they're super powerful and they can survive anything. In fact, it's a delicate and it's a fragile ecosystem, and one footprint of someone who's trying to take a selfie and accidentally steps backwards off the boardwalk, if they don't burn their foot in the hot spring, they may also end up instead in that footprint destroying a small piece of this ecosystem. And some studies on things like this have shown that it can take decades for the microbial or the bacterial mats to grow back to what they were before someone just randomly stepping on them. Okay, so what we're talking about here is microbiology. And microbiology is a part of biology, which is the study of life. Microbiology is the study of small life. This is connected to or containing lots of different fields. So there's bacteriology, which is the study of bacteria, virology, the study of viruses, parasitology, the study of parasites, many of which are microbes, mycology, which is the study of fungi, many of which are microbes, and immunology, which is the study of how immune systems are able to detect and fight off what is usually microbe infections. So small is a relative word, and so a more specific definition for microbiology as the study of small life is a very human-based definition. Small in this case is anything invisible to the naked eye. So you're welcome to take a second to think about what it is that's kind of the smallest thing you can see. And for most of us, the smallest thing that we can see is going to be maybe like a grain of sand or the width of a human hair. If you think of those, that gets you pretty close to what the bottom limits of your own eyesight are. And it turns out to be around zero point 0.1 millimeters. Anything smaller than that, and it's invisible to us. Okay, so it doesn't mean that things aren't alive. It doesn't mean that there isn't interesting biology going on at those levels. It just means that we can't see it. So, small life can have a big impact from the prismatic spring, the picture at the top there, to the pictures of viruses and bacteria down below. You can start to think about what some of the other impacts are of this little life that we can't always see. Okay, so one of the big impacts of microbial life is disease. Now, disease, in its simplest definition, is a lack of comfort, an inconvenience. Okay, so I would say that most people, when they say the word disease, they're probably thinking about something more dramatic than just being slightly inconvenient. You don't usually say that if you're waiting in the checkout line at the grocery store and it's a long line, that you've got a disease. But it is a form of a lack of comfort, and it's good to keep in mind that disease has a broad range of potential symptoms, and sometimes it's the little symptoms that end up telling us a lot about a story, or give us a chance to predict what's going to happen next. So there's much more dramatic things that fit into the category of disease, including sicknesses, illnesses, and disorders. Okay, so there are many diseases caused by small life, caused by microbes. We're going to start with two examples that I think are really interesting. The examples we're going to talk about are a disease called ergotism, and it's also known as St. Anthony's fire, which is a great name. And we're also going to talk a little bit about frost damage infections. As I go to talk about ergotism, I want to first show you some questions that we'll come back to at the end, but I want to give you a chance to read these questions so you can already be looking ahead at what sort of questions might be asked of you on this material. So when it comes to ergotism, we'll be looking at things like what type of microbe is the causing agent of ergotism. Quick true false here, ergotism is a disease caused by ingestion of either ergotamine or lysergic diethylamide. You can see that we'll be getting into some molecular names there. And third, how is epidemiology helpful in understanding and treating a disease like ergotism? So keep those questions in the back of your mind as we start looking through the material. Okay, so here's a little bit of history. It's where the art world crosses over with the medical world, crosses over with the microbiology world. This is the Temptation of St. Anthony. It's a triptych, which means there's 3 panels in the painting. It's by an artist called Hieronymus Bosch, and it's from a long time ago, a little bit over 1,500 years ago. He painted this painting. Now we're going to look closely at a couple of the specific images in this painting, and but first I just want to make sure you guys take a look at the overall kind of chaos that's present here. It's certainly not a painting that instantly evokes a sense of happiness. It's pretty quickly looking like some terrible things are going on. Okay, so the name of this, St. Anthony's Fire, comes from a time when people were likely to come down with a disease called ergotism. At the time, they called the disease St. Anthony's Fire, and it was because of the monks of St. Anthony, who were known for working hard to treat this disease. As people came down with this disease, two of the hallmarks of the disease in terms of symptoms were burning sensations and hallucinations. So then if you look at the painting, you'll see some really bizarre imagery. There's a couple of people flying through the sky on a fish. You can see a bird that's wearing ice skates and going ice skating on a frozen pond. Um, I think that sort of evokes the hallucination aspect of the symptoms of this disease. Bosch might have been literally painting things that people spouted out or talked about as they were hallucinating with this disease. You can also see in some of the other imagery, um, in the painting, there's people carrying the dead, showing the impact of how many people were suffering and how the symptoms got to the point of death in some cases. There's the image of the fire to represent those burning sensations that come up as a symptom. And then finally, we have a little art thing going on here where we have the self-portrait of the painter. And that's Bosch in the corner looking back at the viewer. And you can also see there that he's drawn a little instance of temptation. And temptation was considered to be, say, the first theory as the cause of this disease. Temptation causing the hallucinations and burning sensations. Well, another term that's really important to microbiology is the term pathogenesis. And pathogenesis describes the conditions of a disease. So if we look at the conditions related to ergotism, that's going to be burning sensations, hallucinations, there's involuntary muscle contractions, and there's a secondary infection that occurs called gangrene. So that's a bacterial infection that happens as tissue loses blood flow, the immune system can no longer access it, and you suddenly get growth of organisms that can cause gangrene. So if you think about this set of symptoms, you can start to ask questions like, what explanations did people have at the time? And you can also think about this in terms of what happens when there's new diseases today. How do we determine a new disease? How do we classify that it's not something that we've seen before? How do we know it's new? So these are really important questions, and I guess I want to emphasize that the people at the time were working with the information that they had, and they were starting to make guesses of what could be the cause that would lead to this effect. Okay, so the other way that we look at cause and effect in diseases today is a field called epidemiology, and this is the analysis of disease patterns. Okay, and so this turns out to be really important whenever we are trying to identify a new disease. In the case of ergotism, some of the patterns that you would see is that people tended to get sick in the fall. That tells us something, that something must be happening that's seasonal for this particular set of symptoms. It would pop up in one town but not another, even if they were under generally similar conditions. They're just a couple miles apart from each other. They get the same level of rain, the same level of snow, etc. But one town has people getting sick and another doesn't have the sickness. It happens more often in people that eat undercooked food, and it happens more often in those that already have a stomach ulcer. So if you start looking at patterns like that, it can get you closer to figuring out what is causing the disease. If you look at those last two examples related to food and stomachs, it sort of tells you that ergotism is probably being caused by something that people are eating or drinking. If you go a little further towards outbreaks occurring in the fall, and again, we're in the 1500s, so you can think about maybe it's something that's happening as people harvest a crop. And as you look at something happening in one town but not another, it tells you that maybe not every field of crops has the causative agent of the disease. So we can start to get closer and closer to pinpointing what this disease is coming from. Okay, it turns out that ergotism is related to an organism called Claviceps purpurea. It's a fungus, and it infects rye, which was a common food staple in Europe in the 1500s. When it infects rye, you can actually see the fungal growth. It has a morphology called the cockspur morphology, and it's these darker and larger extensions that happen on the area with the rye seeds. Now, in this particular picture, it's a really obvious difference between the cockspur and the rest of the rye. As rye continues to age, it gets darker and darker brown in color, and so there's many times where you really can't tell the difference between an infected rye plant and an uninfected rye plant just from looking at it. Okay, so the fungus, Claviceps purpurea, is a plant pathogen. It's infecting the plant in order to make these cockspur morphologies. So the plant is sick. In the process of growing, it releases a molecule called ergotamine, and you can see that molecule in the bottom right of the screen. Ergotamine is a fairly complicated looking molecule with several ring structures in it, but there's a smaller molecule called lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, um, which a lot of people have heard of before. And if you look at the structure of LSD, you can see how it relates to the structure of ergotamine. And it turns out that LSD was first produced by chemists using ergotamine as a starting source to try to find some molecules that could have some beneficial psychological impacts on humans. And of course, the impacts of LSD are really powerful, but they're not exactly the same as the impacts you'd get with ergotamine. And it tells us a little bit about how these molecules are acting based on their different impacts. Okay, so if we get back to prevention and treatment of this disease, on the prevention side, it's actually pretty simple. You can soak rye in a briny salt water. The rye will sink and any cockspurs will float up. You just have to soak them and agitate them a little bit, and then you can pull off the top any of the infected parts, and the parts left behind won't have the fungus, and they won't have ergotamine, and it's safe to eat. If somebody has already been exposed to the ergotamine molecule, then there is a treatment for it. It's sodium nitroprusside. That's a blood thinner. And if you can catch the symptoms and diagnose the disease quickly enough, treatment with this blood thinner, as well as monitoring, can allow someone to have enough time to clear the ergotamine out of their system and recover. Now, the last modern outbreak of this was in France in the 1950s, and it was characterized by several people coming down with hallucinations, and 5 people died in that outbreak. And the main reason for death was people hallucinating and then jumping off of buildings, things like that. So the hallucination part of the symptoms can actually be fatal as people put themselves into more and more dangerous situations. Now, the full extent of ergotism is unknown. It's hard to go back into the past and diagnose exactly what would have caused things, but there are a couple of cases that make people wonder if maybe ergotism was an underlying cause. So if you know anything about the early colonial United States of America, there was the Salem witch trials, which had a lot of um, hallucinatory events in them, and that might have been uh, low level exposure to ergotamine from infected rye, causing some of the hallucinations there. There was also this event in Europe called the dancing mania, where people started to dance, and in this mania they wouldn't stop dancing, and as some people started to dance, others in the town would come and join them and start dancing as well, and they would dance themselves to the point of exhaustion, and in some cases they danced themselves to death because they wouldn't eat, they wouldn't drink, and they just you know went into this dancing hallucination till death. So it's another case where maybe ergotamine was somehow involved in this. Now the stories there get more interesting because actually the leaders at the time didn't know what to do. So in some cases they thought that people just needed to get the dancing out of them. So they actually brought in bands. They brought musicians in to play. Figured as long as people are dancing, we may as well have some music playing. And it turns out that backfired. That just caused more people to come and hear the music and dance, and then more deaths to occur. So, gotta be careful when symptoms start to break out, and try to figure out what the best, you know, sort of public relations tactic is. Okay, so let's come back to these questions, and I want to give you a chance to see if this short lesson on ergotism uh, allows you to answer these questions. So go ahead and write down the answers for yourself, and we'll talk about the answers next time.